Hello and welcome to Reader 2 Standing By, Episode 6. I'm Wedge,
And I'm Wraith14.
and we are so happy to have you join us in our journey through the X-Wing series of Star Wars stories from the old expanded universe. Spoiler alert, we will spoil all the books and comics we've covered so far, and the entire book we're reading today, which is X-Wing Book 2, Wedge's Gamble. And this, of course, is by Michael A. Stackpole. It was released in May of 1996. The same month that it was published saw the finale of the Phantom Affair, X-Wing Rogue Squadron number 8, the second arc of the X-Wing Rogue Squadron's comic published, and also in May 1996, Shadows of the Empire by Steve Perry was published. And the comic also started that month, but so we say Shadows of the Empire, and I'm sure all the action figures and video game dropped around the same time. The Krytos Trap, the third book in the X-Wing series by Michael Stackpole, would follow in October 1996, 5 months after Wedge's Gamble, and Battleground Tatooine starts in June, so it basically fills the gap between Wedge's Gamble and the Krytos Trap. The Battleground Tatooine arc also fleshes out the beginning of Tycho's relationship with Winter, which is explored a bit in Wedge's Gamble. So it's kind of fun seeing how Stackpole worked to include information from the comics without going too far in the future of the comics, even though the novels all take place a year or so after the comics are finished. We've mostly covered this whole context in universe of what was going on in Rogue Squadron. So this book takes place, I think it's about a month to 2 months after the end of the Rogue Squadron book. Or is that too much? How long does it take between these two books?
I mean, how long is it from Rogue Squadron to Wedge's Gamble?
Yeah. How long does it say Bror Jace died?
Well, it's Wedge's Gamble is a month since the Rebels, New Republic, took Orleans.
Okay, so it's 1 month after the end of Rogue Squadron. So basically, nothing really happens between these two books. There's no short stories. There's no other novels that sort of fill this gap. The X-Wing books kind of are an unbroken run of stories that cover the period from the Shadows of Mindor and then Courtship of Princess Leia. They kind of fill that gap. All right, let's get on to our mission report. You want to start us out and we'll sort of alternate paragraphs?
Sure. So, as it sets up the it's been 1 month part, we see on board Orleans, Quarren and 2 Y-Wing pilots from General Som's group are thwarting an attempt by Warlord Zinj to probe the system under New Republic control. After that, Wedge is adding 2 new pilots to the squadron to replace their losses in the first book of Lujane Forge and Dorney Wheat, the Rodian Peshk, who was the Bothan, and Bror Jace, whose death was off-screen when he was going to Thyphera and was apparently intercepted en route. Quarren and Tycho are uncovering the secrets of Emtre's strange behavior during the last book, and Tycho shares with Quarren his tragic tale of having been captured by the Empire and imprisoned in the brainwashing prison Lusankya.
Wedge travels to the New Republic world of Noquivzor to attend the Provisional Council's deliberations on the next steps to conquering Coruscant. Although When we read this book, it was Coruscant because the movie hadn't come out. The council decides, pushed mostly by Akbar and Phalia primarily, to use Kessel's prisoners to revive Black Sun, to fight the Empire on the planet, and infiltrate the rogues to figure out how to take down the planetary shields.
As part of that, the rogues go in disguise to Coruscant, also called Imperial Center, in three main groups: Wedge and the new pilot Ash Kraken, who's the son of the New Republic intelligence chief General Aaron Kraken, and they meet up with Ayala Waziri, Corrin's old partner in Corsac, and accidentally include Myrix Tarek as well, while Corrin and Marisi Galaret have met up with Winter. Gavin Rivshiel, who's the Shistavinin Wolfman, Nawara Van, who's Twi'lek, Rosati Yanir, and Oral infiltrate what's known as Investec, the Undercity area where the Imperials are confining the majority of Coruscant's alien population. Each of them is testing out and exploring various features and factions of the galactic throne world. And in this exceptionally twisty central action sequence, Corrin literally drives a swoop or speeder bike from his plotline with Arisi and Winter through Wedge and Ayala's plotline and right into Gavin's. At that point, the rogues gather back together to try to seriously take down the planetary shield rather than continuing to gather information.
Meanwhile, Kirtan Lure manages General Deracote in creating Isard's virus, the Krytos virus, which only kills aliens, leaving humans uninfected. The purpose is to tear the New Republic apart when Isard lets them conquer Coruscant, and they have to spend money they don't have on Bacta to cure the aliens they've come to save.
The rogues launch two major attacks on the shield system. First, they attempt to sneak into the computer systems, but Curtin Lore completely disrupts that plan with a big stormtrooper raid, aided by treacherous Black Sun elements and his hidden traitor in Rogue Squadron. Only Tycho Selchu's surprise appearance in the Z-95 Headhunter saves the day, though Corrin is convinced that Tycho is the hidden traitor all along. Second, when Wedge receives word from Akbar that they have 2 days before the fleet arrives to launch a three-part attack, first using a giant construction droid to brute force its way to seize the computer network, using the computers to control one of the orbital mirrors to melt a gigantic water reservoir and create a titanic storm that knocks out the power of the shields, while Corrin and 4 other rogues are flying headhunters to protect the construction droid, and ultimately they take out the last power station to drop the shields.
Akbar and the fleet arrive, launching a massive ground landing and taking out the Imperial fleet elements orbiting the planet. However, in the battle, Corrin's starfighter crashes. The non-human members of the rogues get sick with the Krytos virus, and Tycho is arrested for Corrin's murder. However, in the final chapter, we see Corrin has been captured by Isard and is being taken to the Lusankya for brainwashing. So let's start with our discussion of the cover. This is a picture of a Lambda-class shuttle. Which
this is the original cover, that is.
Yes, the original cover painting by Paul Ewell, which, as a piece of art, I think is actually really pretty. It's really gorgeous. Lots of detail. The ships look cool. They look right. There's a lot of action. We've got a couple X-Wings behind the shuttle, a huge explosion, and an A-Wing flying beneath the explosion. The one problem is nothing like this cover happens in any part of the entire book.
Yeah, I mean, there are X-Wings. There is, at one point, a Lambda shuttle. There is a now former A-Wing pilot, but you don't really see all of this put together.
Yeah. Unlike the first third, and fourth books, all of which portray significant parts of the battles in the actual book. And I would say the Wraith Squadron covers also portray significant events in the books themselves. You just can't figure out if this is an impressionistic cover. It's not really representative of anything that happens in the book.
Especially because if you look closely, you can tell the planet down at the bottom is clearly supposed to be Coruscant.
Yes, especially if you look at the textless cover without the trade dress, you can really see the city and atmosphere that make it look surprisingly like the movie version of Coruscant, even though the movie wouldn't come out for another 3 years.
That is a good point I hadn't thought about. So yeah, definitely not knocking the quality of the art. It's just somewhat confusing. But if you think about it in terms of how the other 3 books in the first 4 are, it would be really hard to have a cover like that for this book, since so much of it happens on the ground or in low atmosphere.
Yep. And if you look at the essential legends, we have the Republic crest with a rebel pilot, and you can't really tell who it is. It's a human, but you can't tell if it's Wedge or Corrin or Tycho. And he's got TIE fighters reflected in his eye shield. This honestly feels kind of generic to me. I like the essential legends. I like the theme and general art style okay, but it doesn't feel very specific. And we've talked about this a little bit with the Wraith Squadron and Iron Fist covers. The characters featured don't seem to be particularly featured in the book that they chose to put the covers on.
The cover, I mean, it could be any X-Wing book, really. Now, if it had been, if you want to hold it up again, in a green tint instead of blue, that would make it more clear to Corrin, but...
Yeah, well, but you can't do green because Krytos Trap is green.
True.
Like Rogue Squadron's red, Wedge's Gamble's blue, Krytos Trap is green, and Back to War is purple. And then we've got yellow, orange, and sort of like a darker orange for Solo Command.
Krytos Trap should have been red and blue, since it has...
Should have been what?
Red and blue, since it has eyesight.
Well, but it does have the red and blue eyes.
Yeah.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about the big picture view of this book. In our description for this book, I called this the most fun, pulpy adventure that the series gets. I think if you just think about the exciting adventures of swoop races and alien riots and labyrinthine bioweapon development and brainwashing and all these elements, is very pulp sci-fi adventure, and the characters are they go through a lot of really cool stuff and they do a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah.
However, on a big level, this plot does not make a whole lot of sense, because if you think about it, the most populous planet probably in the galaxy gets its heavily guarded defense system taken down by about 20 people.
Yeah, it kind of gets hand waved at first, with Isard wanting the New Republic to capture Coruscant, but then there's a point like 2/3 of the way through where things aren't happening on the timescale she wants, and she just outright tells Curtain War, just kill the rogues. So that part of her thinking has kind of gone out the window.
Yeah, and that's an interesting part of the plot. Do you think that Isard's plan makes overall sense? Like, there are definitely pieces of it that make sense, like the idea of psychological warfare, of destroying aliens to make them distrust and hate humans and trying to tear apart the New Republic that way. I think that makes sense. But the idea that she just gives up the capital planet with minimal attempt to defend it, that part seems to me to make her look really stupid, and I don't think that Stackpole meant her to look stupid. Do you disagree?
Yeah, it seems like it would make more sense to spread Krytos Trap on New Republic worlds.
Yeah, that would actually be really smart if she spread it on Noquivzor or Mon Calamari or, any of these major planets. Heck, well, no, she wouldn't want to do Kashyyyk because there's this whole conversation about she doesn't want to use the virus on slave races, which is a special kind of nasty.
Yeah, I mean, there's an element of it I can't explain that kind of adds more sense to it, but still,
I feel like Stackpole kind of has Isard hold the idiot ball a lot in this series. And she gets a lot smarter in Isard's Revenge, but that's after 4 books of her being kind of dumb. And the funny thing is she's pretty smart in the comics. Like, her whole rise to power portrays her as being pretty smart. Maybe Stackpole's intention is to show that Isard is really best when she's working adversarially. She's really good when she's fighting an enemy who's entrenched and stronger than she is. She sucks when she's the one on top.
Yeah, she's also a career intelligence officer who's risen up through the ranks and betrayed her father to become
She's not an administrator.
She's not a military strategist.
She super is not a military strategist.
And this is where we see that. But she's doing the job of being like commander of the military and probably should have delegated that.
Yeah, and that's another problem with the macro plot. Like, there's a mention of Star Destroyers that fight the New Republic fleet, but the Golan 2s are supposed to be bigger threats than Imp Stars, and that seems wrong to me if you look at the actual stats. Now, it's possible that Golan 2s didn't actually have stats when Wedge's Gamble was written, and the stats that made it significantly less powerful than a Star Destroyer were written after this book, and it's sort of like the 8-kilometer Super Star Destroyer problem. They only decided how big these things were and how strong they were after the novels were written, and they didn't pay attention to what the novels said they could do.
Yeah, I mean...
But, like, Isard, even if she is thinking like an intelligence officer, she commands the entire Imperial remnant, which, unless you're going to argue that basically she only controls Coruscant, which it's clear she doesn't. I mean, she controls that admiral that Lure works for in the first Rogue Squadron novel. Like, she gives orders to a lot of fleet elements in the first book, but in this book she doesn't do anything. She could have easily called in a ton of fleet elements, and she does nothing.
And you'd think when there's concern, well, I think she says, like, oh, Zinj wouldn't dare attack me.
But why not?
Because he has a Super Star Destroyer that could definitely take on what he's got in orbit over Coruscant.
Yeah, I feel like a Super Star Destroyer would eat a Golan 2 for lunch. I don't know. I feel like if you step back and think about it, the conquest of Coruscant is very boy adventure novel, which is to say, I really enjoyed reading this book again. I did not have a single time where I was like, this book is not fun, this book is not exciting, or this book doesn't even make sense. Like, every piece of the book makes sense when you're reading it in order. But I still think that Stackpole should have thought the intelligence operation on Coruscant should have been much bigger, and the resistance that led to the shield takedown should have been much, much bigger. Like, it just should have been bigger. And I get that it's already a really big book. There's a lot of people, a lot of events. It's very twisty. Stackpole actually does a lot more with ensemble, which we'll talk about when we get to the characters. But this is just such a big thing. Part of me wishes that Stackpole had conceived of this as a 4-book lead up to the conquest of Coruscant, you know? So like each book is a next significant step. So the final step is the big battle. But I understand he wanted to be more twisty and he didn't want to spend too much time all doing one thing, because you kind of get a lack of variety if that's what you're trying to structure your books at, which we see in a lot of streaming TV series now, which are stories that are stretched out way too long. Like Stackpole definitely doesn't stretch out the taking of Coruscant too long.
Yeah, I was thinking, well, kind of important to note if you're really not familiar. So Coruscant was, at least as far as novels go, set up in the Thrawn trilogy, and the New Republic had it. So it being taken here was kind of a predetermined outcome. But yeah, I definitely like the book conceptually because it gets some flack for not having nearly any X-wing element, and they're all on the ground doing an intelligence op, which is a separate genre that I like. So that part works for me. There's just some oddities.
I mean, it works for me, but why are they putting their starfighter pilot on the ground as their primary commando element?
Yeah, that beyond the answer of because the plot needs it.
Because that's what he wanted to write. Like, this is clearly what Stackpole wanted to write, and he had a great time writing it. Like, you can tell he was just having a blast writing his speedrite chases and his crime lords. Like, there's so much stuff that just drips with Stackpole having a great time, and I had a great time reading it.
Yeah, it's also funny, which I hadn't thought about when I was reading this when I was younger. Almost every chapter ends with a quote, and it's one that would like be perfectly at home in some 80s action movie.
Yeah, like this is pure 90s, 80s style action adventure. It's really fun. I think that this book is well worth reading. I don't think I can ever promote it to a favorite or even a second favorite in the series, just because I do think it is kind of silly that 20 starfighter pilots do a commando operation that takes down the shields of an entire planet. But it's really fun. It's so much fun. One of the things I think is fun, but is also tricky, is that it's really intricately plotted, especially when you get to the middle section, because you have these 3 different groups of rogues. You got Wedge's group, you've got Corran's group, and then you have Gavin's group. Even though Gavin's not the leader, he's our point of view, which we'll talk about later. But you have these 3 books, 3 plot lines, and as I said, Corran gets on a swoop bike. He calls it a speeder bike, but it's clearly a swoop bike because it's doing airspeeder things. Like a speeder bike has to basically go a meter above the ground, no higher. And this swoop bike's going, basically a plane, just flying thousands of meters above the ground, going up near skyhooks. It's crazy. And he crashes into Wedge's plot and then smashes into Gavin's plot. It's just... And Stackpole talks about this, and he says that the audiobook had to cut out one of the whole plots, so it doesn't make any sense. And I think it's pretty funny and very well constructed, even though it's convoluted.
It's also funny because if you look up like Essential Vehicles and Vessels, the 95 edition info on swoop bikes, it says they can go like 650 miles an hour, which is insane for something that you're riding on like it's a motorcycle.
How do you hold something going that fast?
There is theoretically a motorcycle that can go that fast, but...
Please tell me you got to be like buckled into that thing.
Yeah, I have to assume you've got a harness, and I mean, the wind speed against you alone would be extreme. So,
yeah,
it's some of the lore on this is weird.
It's wild. So I think that takes care of the kind of big picture things. Did you have any more big picture things before we get to characters?
No, that was it.
Yeah, let's talk. We have a bunch of new characters. we kind of listed them out in no particular order, so we'll just go in the order that we listed them. First one is Ayala Wisiri.
So she's been mentioned more by reference and at least once by name as the woman in Coruscant who worked with Corran. I'm trying to think. Yeah. So he tells a story about her, which we'll touch on this more later in the first book. And now we get to see her in person and find out she doesn't know Corran is an X-Wing pilot for the New Republic, let alone on this mission because of compartmentalization.
Now, something that's kind of interesting about Iella is she's a very big part of Wedge's life and Corran's life. But if you were just reading this book for the first time, what would you think about Ayala? Like, you mostly think that she's Corran's best bud because she tells that story about Corran and she's got that cop brain. Like, she's very competent, but you don't get a lot of description of her. You don't get a ton of her personality outside of being a cop and Corran's friend. She feels, I don't know, she just feels kind of sketchy to me. Not sketchy as in like she's shady, but like not super fleshed out in this book to me.
Yeah, I mean, she's kind of playing second fiddle on the intelligence side to Winter, and Myrix is also involved heavily in that once she's not able to leave the planet. So
it's kind of funny in the audiobook, Marc Thompson gives Ayala a kind of crackly voice, which makes her sound a lot older than I always think of her. It's kind of weird. I really hope they do Adumar because I want to hear how that scene between Wedge and all the scenes between Wedge and Iella go with that voice.
Yeah, that would be interesting for sure. Or even some of her roles in books in between now and then, since you mentioned she's in that. But
yeah. Let's talk about a character who I think actually has a lot more texture to her in this book, and then kind of disappears for the rest of the series.
Yeah,
Iniri
wonder who that could be. So she's Lujane's younger sister, and appears when the New Republic and the Rogues are going to retrieve Black Sun people off the prison world Kessel. Because so in the first book, Lujane talked about how, my family is from Kessel, but we went there to teach people. We weren't prisoners ourselves. And so she kind of called Corran out in a friendly way about his judgments about her. And Iniri is a lot more bitter when it comes to that. And is dating / cutting drugs for, or in this case, Glitterstim, one of the main Black Sun people. They bring in Zekathine, who has a long criminal history and past with Corran from when he was in Coruscant.
Now, I would say that I think Zekathine is a weak point to the book. He's really just stupid.
Yeah.
And honestly, he's pretty stupid in the side trip novella where Stackpole and Tim Zahn show how Corran and his dad captured Zekathine. And so I just find him really boring. I don't think he's interesting. But
he's a good narrative device to move things along.
Yeah, he's a good narrative device. I just feel like he's all look and no real character. He's just kind of super boring. Iniri I like because she's got sort of a punk vibe. I mean, it says that she's got part of her hair is dyed, and I'm curious if she keeps that after this book because they basically never describe her that much. I don't think they do, because I feel like Stackpole would probably have mentioned that, because she actually has a pretty big scene in Solo Command, and he doesn't mention that she has a dyed hair. Does she? I don't think so.
I'm looking up her book entry.
I think it just says she's a trim brown-haired woman.
That sounds about right from what I remember off the top of my head. Let me pull up Solo Command.
I do like the fact that Iniri has a Australian accent like Lou Jane in the first book, because Kessel being Australia, the planet of convicts, is kind of a funny choice for Marc Thompson to make.
Yeah, so she has long brown hair in Solo Command.
Yeah, but no mention of the blue thing. So I feel like the blue thing's supposed to be her connection to Black Sun, and she kind of stops that when she joins up with the Rogues. And
I mean, she's very much rebelling against her parents by being with Second too.
Yeah. I like her arc. I like the fact that she's gradually seeing Zeke-Thine for who he is, this vicious abuser, and she ultimately kills him. Like, I liked that, because it means that Corrin doesn't get to be the guy. She actually gets to save him, and she has her own arc. And I think that's cool. I think that Stackpole actually does a pretty good job with her in this book. We next have Pash Kraken, who has a huge structural position in the Star Wars military and intelligence community, and appeared once before in The Last Command. Now, chronologically, of course, Last Command is after this, but I think that's the first book that created him. What do you think about Pash? I mean, we both have a big fondness in our hearts for him because he's an A-wing pilot.
Yeah, he gets an interesting setup where he applies to join Rogue Squadron, and Wedge has to ask him outright, you command your own unit, you're famous for having gone to the Empire for flight training under an assumed name, and then convincing your entire wing to defect. And I think they took out a Star Destroyer on their way out.
Yep.
In one of the Thrawn books, I think it's The Last Command, it might be earlier, there's a maneuver that's known as the Kraken Twist.
Yep, that's Last Command.
That's named after Pash. The details of it, as set up in Last Command, as far as when it was created, don't line up with X-Wing. I won't go into the full explanation of that, but it's basically that in Last Command it's mentioning as being something set up 2 years ago, but is known to Han and Wedge in a setting they were not in under X-Wing. So that part's interesting. But
I think, honestly, you could just push it a little further back.
Well, the twist, ironically enough, is to insert the number 2 into coordinates. So my headcanon is it wasn't actually 2 years ago, and that's just Han cluing Wedge in that, hey, this is what we're doing.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I like that. Sort of like the code. It's sort of like the code words in Solo Command. Like, you insert specific details into the pre-programmed phrase, and that tells people what to do.
Yeah, so Pash is interesting. So he's, obviously very qualified, very experienced pilot, more used to a different, I'll say for myself, better starfighter, and is wanting to take a demotion in rank to join the Rogues because, as he explains, his image among other pilots has gotten to the point that they think he's invulnerable, and they're invulnerable by association, and that's going to put them at risk, which we see a bit of in a later book. That attitude, I mean.
Yeah, I was about to mention that back to war is something I like for seeing how that plays out. I think I think unlike Iniri, Pash is kind of a wasted opportunity. He has a stellar first scene, but we don't get any point of view from him, and he really doesn't do anything in this book. Like he's background player number 12 basically
Yeah,
in this whole book. And I think that's such a disappointment because his first scene is so good. Like that desire for him to be challenged is a really cool thing. But we never see him be challenged. We never see him struggling with those things. And so he's this great potential that is never realized. And again, I get handling 12 main characters in a squadron's hard, and this book adds even more characters that Stackpole's juggling, and so some people are just going to be underused. I just feel like we got to be straightforward and say Pash is definitely underused and not really that much of a character after that first scene.
he also has experience infiltrating imperial organizations,
Right. I
and
mean, he could have been a lot more useful in a lot of these circumstances.
but it does come into play in the third book. That Pash was around in the background in the second book. I just can't elaborate yet.
Yeah. Well, we'll definitely try and track these characters because even though I said that I think Ayala is kind of a not really a character in this book, she definitely becomes a character in the next several books. Uh, Next, we have a very interesting character, Asir Selar, who is a female Bothan. We first meet her when she accuses Gavin of being a bigot because he doesn't want to dance with her in a bar, and she tries to kill him to send a message to Imperials who are stealing aliens to experiment on. What do you think about Asir?
That's yeah, that's not a good thing to do, tactically, morally, what have you.
I mean,
Uh,
she's kind of Saw, Saw Gerrera. She's kind of the
yeah,
Bothan Saw Gerrera before Saw existed.
it's also pretty heavily implied later on that she's actually in the Bothan military this whole time and was sent in as Borsk's contingency plan
Yeah, I
because
think
she has to awkwardly tell Wedge, I'm flight qualified in a headhunter. I was at the Bothan Military Academy, uh, did just as well as Pashk, the Bothan from the first book who dies. And Wedge is like, so what's someone trained militarily by the Bothan Academy doing on Coruscant right now? And she awkwardly tells him, I'd really rather not answer that.
and I have to say, I love Asir. I think she's an awesome character, but her backstory is never adequately explained. She never has a reason for doing what she does in this book. But she has an amazing arc as we go forward. Just this book kind of sets up one thing and that's not paid off. Other things are paid off though. I think it's kind of funny that we get the startings of Asir's romance with Gavin. Gavin is clearly smitten with Asir in this book, and it's kind of a bummer that we never get to see a whole lot of that early stages. We kind of jump into it in the next book. Um, but I think it's funny. I read these books before I read the Thrawn trilogy. I think I read all four of the X-Wing books before I read the Thrawn trilogy. And I came in thinking that Bothans were kind of cool because Asir was a Bothan. Now, yeah, Phalia was also a Bothan. He was crummy, but Asir was clearly the cool Bothan. And a lot of people read the Bothans in Zahn's book, and they're like, oh man, Bothans suck. And I read the Bothans in this book, and so I'm like, Bothans are kind of cool. She's got a great romance with Gavin. She's a great pilot.
I think I was Thrawn first, but I can't remember for sure.
Our next character is a fun connection to the movies, just sort of like Gavin was the cousin of Biggs Darklighter. A real Num is the sister of Neen Num, who is Lando Calrissian's co-pilot in The Return of the Jedi. What do you think about Ariel?
I mean, does she really do that much besides get infected with Krytos?
So I actually would disagree that she doesn't do that much. She has an early scene. Now, I think the reason people don't remember is that this scene doesn't really matter. Like, the scene mostly exists for Stackpole to get a bit more X-Wing action into the book before it goes to Coruscant. But while Wedge is meeting with the Provisional Council on Naquivzor, Ariel, since she's the highest ranked, although it's kind of funny that they made Ariel the captain instead of Pash, because Pash is also a captain.
Yeah.
But Ariel leads the squadron, and because the squadron is down basically an entire flight, it's only about 8 pilots because Wedge is gone and they've lost a bunch. Ariel is captain. She's second in command of the squadron in rank, and she leads the squadron on this mission. And we watch her just take Corrin to school. Like, she is a amazing pilot. She just blows the competition out of the water. She probably would have beaten Bror Jace easily if she'd been in the first book.
Actually, she was mentioned in the
Yes,
first
she
book,
was
too.
mentioned. And her thing is she
Just
can't teach. She's just this amazing, intuitive pilot, but she can't teach.
She's like Maverick in Top Gun Maverick.
Yeah, although I think that Top Gun Maverick does show that Maverick can teach.
Yeah, he just has a line about, like, it's not what I can teach, it's who I am.
I think, sidetrack, I think in Maverick, honestly, the reason Maverick doesn't want to teach is because he knows he'll fall in love with his students. Not in a romantic way, but he falls in love with him in that he doesn't want any of them to die. You know, he's got that father to his men attitude towards him, and he doesn't want to have his heart ripped out every time that one of his pilots gets shot down or crashes, you know?
Wow.
I feel like that's really what he means when he says he's not a teacher. It's not that he's a bad teacher. I feel like it's because he would invest so much and it would be so heartbreaking.
Well, speaking of people who are like a father, or in this case, godfather, Fleury Voru,
who is the former Grand Moff. I think he's a Grand Moff. He's the Moff of the Corellian sector, and since the Corellian sector is one of the most crucial sectors in the entire core worlds, I would say he probably merits the title of Grand Moff. And he was considered a rival in power to Senator Palpatine when he became Emperor. So Palpatine sent him to Kessel. Now, Voru had this whole thing of sort of looking the other way when Black Sun was operating in Corellia. And he created this devil may care, law and order is not that important. It's all about trade and dashing adventure. And that's kind of Stackpole's explanation for why Corellians don't care about odds and are kind of rebels, because, you know, Fleury Voru basically ran Corellia as a pirate barony. And when the rogues pull him off Kessel, he becomes the godfather of Black Sun on Coruscant. And that's kind of funny. What do you think about Fleury in this book?
Yeah, so that's he's definitely, well, he's kind of in charge of Black Sun, but that's mainly because Black Sun has been largely defunct. So if you haven't read Shadows of the Empire, spoilers, in that Zizor, I don't know how you pronounce his name, is the head of Black Sun, bills himself, at least, as the third most powerful being in the galaxy, which I don't exactly buy myself.
He sucks.
Yeah. He at least thinks he's that. He dies.
His sections are unbearable because he's so full of himself.
Yeah, so he dies in that, and in between that and later material, Black Sun...
Not just he dies, Darth Vader vaporizes him.
Yes. Black Sun pretty much crumbles, so Voru...
Well, and in my opinion, great comic, Mara Jade by the Emperor's Hand, his successor, a crime lord by the name of Dequek, is killed and his organization dismantled by Mara Jade just 6 months after Endor. Right, so the 1-2 of Shizor being destroyed by Vader and then Dequek being toppled by Mara Jade, I think really left the entire organization in shambles.
So Voru's in a position now that he's off Kessel to come in and run Black Sun ostensibly for the New Republic, in helping them take Coruscant, which we kind of compared it to how in this case mentioned it's kind of Suicide Squad-esque, and in that movie there's a mention of how the U.S. Navy had some secret deal with the mafia in the U.S. to keep the ports safe during World War II, which is kind of like what's going on here, except it's more go cause trouble on Imperial Center. So that's how Voru gets off Kessel, and that's his arrangement. He also is keeping Zekathine in mind, both in a like you do what I say, and in a physical way where Voru mouths off to Corrin and gets slapped in the gut where it should have been shot already.
Yeah, and the reason we've been joking about The Godfather is because Stackpole explicitly makes a comparison between Black Sun and the Mafia. He says that Black Sun used to be about honor, and you wouldn't attack civilians, you wouldn't attack family, and it's become more brutal, and it's like these mass criminals who just take out entire buildings to kill one person. And there's clearly an element of the escalation of organized crime, and Stackpole making Voru into this Godfather figure feels really appropriate. I think.
Wonder if that was, not to get too much into real world stuff, like a Pablo Escobar type thing, where about the taking out an entire building to get one person because he blew up a plane to kill one passenger.
Yeah, I mean that does sound like what the newer mobs, the newer organized crime would do in the 90s and to some extent the 80s. And now you've got Russian mobs doing that kind of thing all the time. That, I think, is all of our major new characters. Let's talk a bit about how our main characters grow and change. So one of the first ones is Gavin gets a lot of point of view in this book.
Yeah, so since they're split up into three groups, you got Wedge's point of view. I don't remember if you mentioned this before the stream or during the stream. You got Wedge's, Corrin's, and Gavin's. Gavin's in the group that's kind of half human, half alien, and being from Tatooine is kind of having a culture shock moment. He rather hilariously, upon seeing Coruscant, it's like it's all one city, which would then be a line in the Phantom Menace 2-3 years later. Though not by Anakin himself, just to Anakin. So, yeah, Gavin's, very much not in. Well, he's not even from Mos Eisley originally. He's from a small moisture farm on the outskirts type of thing, and is having to take in all the sites and Imperial Center cantinas and Investac, and then kind of gets in trouble when Asir is challenging him. And there's even a point where he's trying. So Nawara is doing his lawyer thing, trying to argue against their point, which we might talk about later. And Gavin even tries to communicate to them, like, don't break our cover, even if it means I get killed.
Yeah, I would say Gavin really comes out of his shell. Like in the first book, he's mostly just kind of the kid. And he does like the Tatooine thing of, I used to bullseye Womprats. Like literally, that's what he did. In this book, you get his whole backstory. You have him talking to his father. You have a lot of backstory of how the Darklighter family fits into the economy of Tatooine. You have this whole relationship between Biggs and his father, Huff Darklighter, which clearly was something that Stackpole was setting up for Battleground Tatooine, which was coming the next month after this came out. You also have just Gavin being such a hero. Like he puts the mission first. He never acts selfishly, and he's really a great type of heroic boys adventure novel. I keep going back to its pulpy adventure in the best way. And I think Gavin being our young, naive but plucky hero is perfect for that kind of adventure. And thinking back when I was a kid, I was about 10 or 11 when this book came out, and I thought Gavin was the coolest. He was, I think, my favorite character in the series the first couple times I read it. Now, of course, I would say Tycho is my favorite character in this Rogue Squadron. Overall, over the whole X-Wing series, Wedge is my favorite, with Lara being my favorite individual book character, which we'll get to, of course, in Solo Command. But when I first read this book, Gavin was the man, and I still think Gavin's really awesome in this book. I loved rereading this book and realizing just how much development and how much strength he's given in this book. Very enjoyable.
Yeah, there's also, when they're coming up with their final strategy to take Coruscant, it's very much a group effort where each person in the group comes up with one element of the plan. But Gavin kicks it off by saying we can make it rain and create a storm, and specifically ties it to how people would go to Huff Darklighter with get rich quick schemes about how to make it rain on Tatooine.
Yeah. Our other main characters also have pretty big chunks. Wedge, of course, leads the squadron, and he also has a lot of point of view. Wedge is very much a chess master in this book. He's got his ace in the hole with Tycho. He's managing Corran. He's doing all this stuff. I don't know if I'd say Wedge changes that much, but he definitely ends the book really sad because, Corran is dead, or so he thinks, and Tycho has been arrested for Corran's murder. So his best friend among the new pilots is dead, and his best friend from his veteran days since Hoth is just in dire circumstances. So I'd say Wedge doesn't really have a huge arc, but he definitely has a huge emotional gut punch at the end of the book. What do you think about Wedge's part of Wedge's gamble?
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't really change that much across the entire X-Wing series.
Except in
first
Star
8
Wars
books,
Vadumar.
at least. I was going to think the same thing there. But, that's because he's the most experienced of any of the characters, combat-wise. So it makes sense that he doesn't really have a whole lot more to go through. I mean, even when he thinks Corran is dead, he's comparing it to like Biggs before him, all the other pilots he's known, and thinks about how, he became Corran, not Lieutenant Horn.
Speaking of Lieutenant Horn, Corran, of course, is a huge part of the book. What do you think his main arc is in Wedge's gamble?
To not trust Tycho, which is weird because it kind of felt like he'd gotten past that in Rogue Squadron, especially with Tycho coming to save the day in the final battle.
Yeah, well,
with Myrix. But now we're back to I don't trust Tycho and no one else should.
I would say that Corran has 3 main motivational arcs in the book. The first one is Tycho, and you see that primarily when he meets Winter, and Winter, of course, being Alderaanian, and as we learn, is in love with Tycho, and they're in love with each other. He really clashes with that because we get in Corran's head, and we see that he feels betrayed because he feels that Tycho hiding the story of the Lusankya from him in the first book means he can't be trusted. And honestly, I don't know if I wholly buy this. Like, this feels a little arbitrary to be, to really make the reader think that Tycho is guilty, because we're so much in Corran's head that if Corran thinks something, then it's probably our emotions will be pulled towards thinking he's right. But I don't feel like Tycho has really done enough to justify how angry Corran gets with him.
Yeah. Sometimes he may be an unreliable narrator.
Oh, yes. He's definitely an unreliable narrator in a lot of ways. I think that the next plot that he has is kind of interesting because it's basically Corran flirts with the idea of dating Arisi, but ultimately completely just decides, no, we'll be friends, but I don't want to date her.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if we were going to get into that part now or the romance part.
Well, I'm just talking about the plot.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the romance a bit later, but I think that is the next major plot. And I think that's interesting how much the Corran and Tycho and Corran Arisi plotlines are intertwined for reasons that we will talk about in Krytos Trap. The last element of Corran's plotline, of course, is another romance, which is that of Corran and Mirax. And we'll get more into depth with that in a little bit when we talk about the romance arcs. But I think it's interesting, just on an impression level, how do you feel about Corran's decision to ask Mirax out just before the big battle? Do you feel like it felt earned and you were emotional about it, or how did you feel?
Yeah, it definitely felt earned, especially as a contrast to the at least twice it had come up with, are you going to pull some, we may die tomorrow, so let's sleep together tonight? This was a much more long future thinking way of handling that.
Yeah, I like the idea of it. I'm just not sure. I think part of the problem is Corran and Mirax basically have 3 scenes together. They have the scene where they meet, and Corran almost goes out to dinner with her, like sort of as friends, but he's definitely thinking about her romantically. And then when they're on the mission in the warehouse, the data chip warehouse, and then the scene where he asks her out, and like that's it. 3 scenes. That's
Well,
all the scenes we have with them.
there's also another
Oh,
one
and
that
then
we'll
there's
talk
the
about in the
slowly.
romance part with
Oh, I forgot about Corran and the otter. I need to put this in.
that is one way of describing it for people who are not familiar with the books.
We will get into that.
Because that's where it really comes out.
That's true. And Corran does really think about it, but we just don't get a sense. I wish that Stackpole had figured out a way to tell one of the scenes from Mirax's perspective. I think actually if he'd told the scene where Mirax watches Wedge pull his smuggler choice trick, I think if that had been from Mirax's perspective, maybe we could have gotten some of the feelings that she was developing for Corran. Because we got some great perspective from Mirax in the first book, but we get no perspective from her in this book. And I think that is a bit of a loss. Actually, that's not 100% true. Don't we get a little bit of Mirax's perspective when she... No, I'm wrong. She drops off Gavin, and we don't get her perspective, and then she meets Wedge. So we don't...
And has to explain to Wedge and Ayala.
Right. So we get a lot of her talking, but we don't get anything in her head. And I feel like it would have been a stronger romantic choice if he'd given her some moments where she's like, man, that Corran is pretty cool in the battle, you know?
The bit where she correctly determines that Wedge and Ash will go to the Galactic Museum to view the Endor displays. Hilarious.
That was... Pilots are so egotistical, they always want to see what the bad guys are talking about them.
Wedge, I don't have an ego. Myrex. See, that's what means you really do.
You're so egotistical, you think you have your ego under control, Wedge. And I think that's a little unfair. I honestly think that Wedge doesn't have that much of an ego, especially compared to Corran. And our last, I would consider him a main character. I'm not sure Stackpole considers him a main character, but of course it's Tycho Selchu. We can't. The thing I told you couldn't say last episode, he blurts out in the 3rd chapter. Tycho just tells Corran his backstory, which reveals the entire mystery of what was going on last book.
Yeah, about how he was on the Sankhya prison and managed to get out.
Do you think that Stackpole should have made that story part of the Rogue Squadron comics? Do you think that Tycho's capture and escape would have been a good 1 or 2 issue arc?
Well, yes, that kind of makes sense as something that could have gone hand in hand with reenlistment.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think Stackpole has said that he didn't think it was a story. He thought it was a setup thing. But that's part of why I think that maybe Stackpole didn't think of Tycho as a main character. Tycho gets some amazing speeches. And in a podcast that I both enjoyed listening to and felt like I could add something else to the conversation, so that's why I'm doing this podcast, Rogue Squadron, when they read Tycho's speech to Corran at the beginning of this book, they played the Captain America theme from the Marvel movies. And so ever since that podcast, I've liked to call Tycho Captain Alderaan. I think he's just such a inspirational and noble and stoic and really cool character. He's got so many depths and nuances, and he's so mature and idealistic. Perhaps he's too idealistic. Perhaps people think he's not human enough. He's too much of an archetype. But I really like a Captain America. I like a Superman type character who does the right thing. He's a Boy Scout or an Alderidian Scout, and I think this book, sort of like Gavin, got some really great development and some great speeches and scenes. Tycho gets some really amazing scenes, like the scene where he stands up to Corran, and Corran's just saying, "You're a spy. You're a traitor. I'm going to prove it." And Tycho isn't angry. He's not defensive. He just says, "I have nothing to hide. Come, do it. I welcome the truth."
And that's after Corran had his whole "woe is me" moment, and Winter completely checked him too. And it's like,
Yeah.
you still think that?
Corran just has a thing about Tycho, I think. I don't know why he's so mean to Tycho, but I love Tycho. I think he's so good. And I think this book, like Gavin, is probably partly why I think that. Although I didn't come to my love of Tycho till much later. But I love him a lot now.
You never get Tycho point of view, though.
And that's because we don't want to know if he's the spy. If we got Tycho's point of view, we'd be like, oh, well, he's clearly not the spy because he was clearly thinking these things. Yeah. Or he clearly is the spy because he was thinking, how can I manipulate Corran in this situation?
So what do we want to talk about next?
Let's move into our most character-focused thematic pairings, which is, of course, romance. So our primary romance, of course, is a triangle between Corran, Mirix, and Arisi. Now,
the setup for their undercover identities. Yeah.
Sorry, say that again?
The setup for their undercover identities.
Well, I want to talk about that in world building, but let's just say that I wonder how much Stackpole was thinking about rom-coms and things like Pretty Woman and these like Cinderella type stories of big class differences when he set up that Corran and Arisi backstory, because it feels very much like he was trying to go for those romance tropes of fake dating and arranged marriage type things.
I'm convinced in universe that Arisi leaned on the person planning it for intelligence. It was like, hey, I'm given 10 million. I think we can have the cover stories be what I want them to be.
And then, of course, we got Corran and Mirix. And honestly, I think that Corran and Mirix is handled reasonably well. But again, I do think that the lack of even one scene where Mirax thinks about Corrin and her own feelings does really kind of hurt my investment in the story, which
Yeah.
is perhaps unfair because I don't have the same criticism for Alston, who doesn't give either Tyria or Dia point of view for their romances with Kel and Face.
Yeah, I mean, Mirix is very hostile to Arisi, and Corrin even kind of calls her out. I'm like, don't say she's not a human being. But if you remember the first book, what Mirix knows that Corrin doesn't is Arisi was like, "I'll destroy your business career if you get in my way, and I'll reward you if you don't." So she's kind of got her reasons to be.
At the
So
same
negative.
time, it's definitely playing into love triangle tropes of
Yes.
jealousy and sort of cattiness, and I don't know. It's there's parts that work and parts that don't. I don't dislike it. I do like Corrin and Mirax as a couple. I do kind of feel warm feelings when Corrin asks her out, but I don't know. It's not my romance for the ages in Star Wars. I would say I definitely, even though it's a very unpopular opinion, I do enjoy Kel and Tyria and even
I'll
Face
take
and Dia
watch.
more than Corrin and Mirax. Sorry, I talked over you. What did you say?
Oh, I was just saying, hot take watch.
Oh, hot take Wedge. That's me. As part of the development of Corrin and Mirix's romance, Gavin, who has his own romance, although it's pretty much entirely off screen, Gavin is falling for Asir, the Bothan, and he asks Corrin about humans dating non-humans. And Ayala and Mirix show up, and Ayala tells the story of how Corrin dated a Solonian, who, of
Well,
course, at this time, had only appeared in Roger McBride Allen's Carillion trilogy and are basically gigantic otters with big tails.
do you have the I don't know if it was around before then, the art that you could pull off
I mean, that art
of
was
the
1995.
Selenian and from the Carillion trilogy? But yeah, it's something that Stackpole says he wasn't fully aware of. So
I do think it makes more sense if you look at like Solonians in Star Wars: The Old Republic. There's a lot of Solonians in that game, and they look much more like characters that a human might date. But if you look at that original art, that is just a humongous otter.
yeah, so to quote the book itself, Selonians are all very lithe, and she was covered with relatively short black fur that glistened a silver blue when the light hit it right. Definitely gorgeous, definitely human, but definitely not human. And that's Ayala speaking, not Corrin.
Yep, it's it is a story. Corrin definitely spent some time in bed with the Solonian, and then they both had allergic reactions to each other, which is one of those things that also made me think that Stackpole watched a fair number of rom-coms.
But in the course of that, Corrin is suddenly very self-conscious, wondering how is Myrix going to react to this story that
Yeah,
I
and
quote dated outside my species.
I think it's interesting that, I mean, it's kind of predictable because if you have Corrin and Mirax kind of ending up together, as this book sort of is leading us to feel, you don't want Mirax to kind of think that Corrin is gross or be kind of like, oh, non-humans are subhuman, like an imperial point of view. But I don't know. Again, I still remember. Oh, at the beginning of this book, Corrin thinks, "What if Mirax has a lover in every port?"
I was just going to mention that. Yeah,
playing off that old stereotype of ship captains. And I kind of wish we had seen more of that. Like Mirax being kind of a practical, just dating a dude in every port. And then when she falls in love with Cora and you see that lifestyle change, she's like, no, I'm committing to this one guy. Like, I think that honestly could have made it even more romantic. But again, we just don't have Mirax's point of view. And of course, we don't know that Mirix did that, but I kind of wish she did because I think it'd be kind of a fun backstory to her.
There's also the funny bit they're talking about whether Corrin had been with people who weren't human. Ayala says there were plenty who weren't human in spirit. Myrix brings up Arisi. He says, I never dated her. And Myrix then points out, well, you pretended to be her Kawadi impregnator, which we'll explain shortly, then kissed her in full view of the Grand Hall of the Galaxy in the Imperial Palace. But how does Myrix know that happened?
Because Ayala told her, obviously.
Oh, yeah. But I wasn't there either. So clearly, there's been some talking going on.
So what I would say is, Winter was there.
Yes,
Winter told Ayala.
Winter told Ayala.
Well, okay, so Winter told Ayala and Wedge, and either Ayala or Wedge told Mirix.
Yeah.
Yes, the gossip in the office.
But yeah, it's also funny because so Corrin's Ayala's telling the story, and Corrin asks her, please don't go into the salacious details of the night. And Myrix is like, you can tell me some other time.
I think that was a little too silly for me, but let's talk a little bit about our other romances. We, of course, have Tycho and Winter, and unfortunately, we only get sort of Winter's longing for Tycho, Winter's sadness that she can't be with Tycho. Tycho, of course, talks about being in love with Winter, but not knowing where she was in the first book. I love Tycho and Winter. I just wish we'd gotten more time where we see them together.
Yeah. The shame they were in the background.
We also, of course, have Rosati and Nawara, who get maybe the sexiest scene outside of Corrin sticking his hand up Arisi's shirt, where Rosati licks his brain tails, or was it his throat? She licks him in public in front of a
stormtrooper just to piss him off. Yeah,
to piss off the stormtrooper. I really wish we'd gotten more of Rosati and Nawara. I think they're a fun pair of characters. I don't know. Nawara does get a big scene where he's a lawyer and he defends Gavin from the mob that wants to kill him and use him as an object lesson for the Empire. And Nawara gets into some really deep philosophical stuff, which we'll talk about a bit later because that's getting into the aliens and humans theme. But I don't know. There's so much potential in Rosati being from Bespin. She, has this connection to Lando. And Nawara, of course, is this lawyer who is a non-human under the Empire. But they're definitely background characters. They're definitely supporting characters.
Yeah.
And the romance is also the supporting romance. We never see them really fall in love. We see them being a couple. We don't see really why they like each other. Partly because we don't get a huge sense of who they are. So it's hard to see why they like each other.
Yeah, it would have been interesting if we'd seen Gavin's point of view and he'd gone.
Yeah, I really wish we'd gotten some of that.
But it would also kind of make sense that Gavin would ask the other human male about human-alien relationships.
Yeah. And I don't know if Stackpole wanted to have Wedge date an otter. So
you mean Corrin?
No, like the other person who was an option with Gavin asking Wedge.
No, I meant that would be why Gavin would go to Corrin rather than Gavin asking Nawara about alien and human relationships, even if.
Well, he could ask Rosati.
Nawara did just
that would be awkward.
Yeah, even if Nawara did just save his life.
Yeah, that's a good point.
He could ask Riv.
Riv has no
thing going on. Yeah,
he's not a character. I get so irritated about Riv.
It could have been.
And lastly, and this is perhaps slightly spoilery, but Wedge and Iella are characters who are supposed to be a romantic couple. Do you get that sense in this book?
It does stand out that Iella remembered Wedge off a wanted poster she saw 6 years ago. Although I don't know if that would have been put back into recirculation after Endor. That could make sense.
Yeah, I don't know.
It couldn't have been right away, because I think Curtin Lore shows it to her, and he wasn't in place, I don't think, at the time of Yavin.
I think Stackpole didn't quite have a full sense of the time frame that he wanted everything to be at this point in writing, because he was still working out the comics.
Yeah, he definitely sets up before this, but retroactively published, not to that in the comics, where it comes out that someone's going on a date with Wedge, and Wes asks if it's because she saw his wanted poster.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the better lines in the comics, I think. Partly because I just love mandatory retirement. I think most of the dialogue is pretty solid in that. But when we get to Krytos Trap, and we definitely get explicit romantic thoughts in that book, I just feel like they come out of nowhere, because Wedge doesn't really think about Ayala at all in this book, except of course as a soldier.
He doesn't really have time to, and they are around each other, seeing each other work, so
I feel like he could have leaned into it a bit, though. He doesn't even describe Ayala. That's one of my things, is he doesn't give us a sense of Wedge noticing her as a woman or a potential romantic partner at all. And then all of a sudden, in Krytos Trap, we're just like, boom, romance. I'm like, wait, what?
Does he think about her that much in the last two chapters, or am I thinking of something else?
No, he does not, because he's mostly thinking about Corran and Tycho.
And Myrex, probably.
Yes. So that's our romances. Some good, some bad, and some paper thin. Let's talk a bit about the world building, because this book does a ton of world building for some interesting planets. We, of course, get a ton of world building for Coruscant, or Coruscant, because most of the action of the book takes place, and Stackpole develops things like in VizSec, where we've got the alien. Is it the Alien Protection Zone? Is that the official name?
Yes.
So it's basically not a gulag, a ghetto that the Empire keeps its non-human work population. You've got the swoop gangs, you've got the skyhooks, and Coruscant is, and the whole Black Sun plot is perhaps where you see so much connection to Shadows of the Empire. Like, Stackpole clearly had read Shadows of the Empire as it was in progress. Obviously, he couldn't read it in the final form because they were both published the same month. But I'm really curious if he talked with Steve Perry the same way he talked to Tim Zahn, because he spends as much time paying off things that are set up in Shadows of the Empire with Black Sun and Coruscant as he does setting up things that will pay off in the Thrawn trilogy.
Had Coruscant been called Imperial Center outside of this?
I don't remember. And honestly, that's something I kind of ignore because it feels awkward to me. I get that he's going for Istanbul, Byzantium, Constantinople type name change depending on who conquers the city. But Imperial Center is just such a boring name.
It's also in
Alpatopia or something.
Yeah.
We get a fair amount of world building for the planet of Kuat. And this just comes up in one chapter when Irisi, who of course is from Thefera, pretends to be a Kuwati ultra-rich merchant daughter who is going to Coruscant to be impregnated by her Telbun, who is a male servant. I have not read a lot of Dune because I don't really like the Dune books, but I did read one of the most recent books of Dune by Kevin J. Anderson called Princess of Dune, in which Princess Irulan has basically a Telboon, a male concubine who is super good at fighting and romance, and he's basically a perfect aid to a princess. And the Telboon is clearly supposed to be in that same vein of a male concubine whose only goal in life is to serve this ultra rich, ultra powerful woman.
Yeah, it's just hilarious because the cover name Arisi uses is Riz Darsk, and then Corrin's Telvin name is Darsk Riz Tel. So they literally just took, renamed him to Arisi's name, flipped the first and last parts, and added Tel for Telvin at the end of it.
And I think that's so fascinating because the reason Kuat is important, of course, is Kuat Drive Yards is the shipyards that created and is the main production facility for Star Destroyers and Super Star Destroyers, as we saw in our Iron Fist episode. And it makes sense to me that you'd have these just hyper wealthy ruling class merchants who control the shipyards. And if I can convince Wraith to do our I Jedi episode, there's an interesting glimpse at Kuati culture in a different section of that. But I really like just the alienness and yet the familiarity of sort of Kuati culture. I think it's so interesting that it sticks out so much. Stackpole doesn't even feature a Kuati character, but he gives us such a vivid taste and texture of what Kuati culture and Kuati life and Kuati values are. Because every time I think of Kuat, I'm like, oh yeah, they've got Telboons. Because of this book.
Yeah, which really detracts from Corrin's romantic view of Arisi. Even though she's not actually Kuati, it still drives home, how different they are in terms of class.
She's not Kuati, but she is.
Yeah, she is Thiferi, the equivalent.
Yeah.
So she's not really having to act.
And we'll talk about Thifera because, I mean, I don't think it's too much of a spoiler if we say a book called The Back to War has a lot to do with Thifera. So we'll get into Thiferan culture in that book. But I just find it so interesting that Stackpole just takes one chapter to sketch out this fictional thing that he didn't need to do this. I think that the Kuati culture is really there, as you say, to kind of highlight the class difference between Corrin and Arisi and show why their romance isn't as healthy as Corrin would really want. But it also serves as this fascinating world building exercise, and I really like it. It's one of the things I do like about this book is it's got a ton of texture. You also get some texture with Corellia, of course, since the book is so much in Wedge and Corrin's points of view, and you get that story about Corsac and the governor's ball and taking out the Solonian. There's a lot of Corellian culture that you get from this. I know Corellia is one of those planets that, since Han Solo is Corellian, a lot of people see it, but I like that Stackpole is deliberate about building the world. He doesn't just make it a planet with humans and some aliens, but it's Corellia. It has a specific culture,
And the Corellian trilogy was already out at this point, right?
Yeah, Corellian trilogy came out in 1995, the year before X-Wing started coming out in 96 to 97.
Okay.
And of course, lastly, we have Tatooine, where because we get so much of Gavin's point of view, you get a lot of world building with the Darklighter family and the idea of Huff as a water and food magnate, and the farming and Gavin's father. And again, because Luke is from Tatooine, Tatooine is overused. People go to Tatooine a lot, but getting a perspective of a Tatooinean character who's not Luke is fun. I think it does build out the world in interesting ways. It doesn't feel overused to me. It feels like it genuinely adds to Tatooine culture. In addition to doing a bunch of world building, as we've mentioned a little bit before, this book has a ton of connections with both the Thrawn trilogy and Shadows of the Empire. We've talked about Shadows of the Empire, how, of course, Shadows of the Empire being set on Coruscant, you've got a bunch of connections with that and how Black Sun functions there. Thrawn trilogy, you've got a ton of references to things like the Katana fleet, which, of course, is the main plot of the Dark Force Rising, the second book of the Thrawn trilogy. You have Winter herself, a character who, of course, is created by Zahn, and Stackpole really tries to dig into her past as a New Republic intelligence operative. And
Ash, too.
yes, Pash Kraken, of course, being in The Last Command, and the purple trees on
They're
Coruscant,
significant.
which are very important in a very spoilery way if you read The Last Command, which I recommend because it's one of my favorite Star Wars books. But the purple trees make me really wonder about those conversations and what other contexts they might have appeared in.
Yeah, speaking of other contexts, we've got stuff that is kind of tied into comics that were very soon to come out at the time Wedge's Gamble was published.
Yeah, Battleground Tatooine, as the title indicates, features Huff Darklighter, Gavin's uncle and Biggs's father, quite heavily, and also features Tycho and Winter's first moves towards romance. Of course, they spent time together in the first comic arc of the Rebel Opposition, but they explicitly become more of a romantic pair in Battleground Tatooine. So it's kind of fun seeing him juggling plot points back and forth between the comics and the novels, without trying to spoil too much of what he was writing himself. Speaking of spoiling, what did you think about the way Stackpole just in the third chapter solved the mystery of M-Tray and solved the mystery of Tycho's backstory all in one chapter? Did you feel like that was a satisfying way to resolve those mysteries from the first book, or did it feel a little abrupt and exposition-y?
I mean, it was a good way to get the info out there, especially since it made Corran even more mistrustful. And it is kind of interesting that he mentions having heard about Lusankia even when he was in Coruscant.
Yeah. Well, Lusankia is one of the big ongoing mysteries because we didn't hear it last time. But Lusankia, of course, is the prison that Isard likes to take people and brainwash them. And Stackpole's been upfront of that. Lusankia, the name, is based on the Lubyanka prison, which was no, it wasn't a prison. Lubyanka was the headquarters of the FSB.
So Square. Oh, the KGB at the time.
It wasn't the FSB at the time?
FSB replaced the KGB after.
What's the GRU then?
I think GRU is military intelligence.
Oh, okay. Okay, that makes sense. So Lubyanka is the horrifying building that, of course, not characters, actual people like Beria, the chief of the KGB, would use to torture and murder and blackmail all kinds of Soviet citizens and officials. And Stackpole was explicitly drawing on that, and I kind of like that. I do think that Lusankia is a name that really sticks in the head, maybe even more than Lubyanka, because there's this kind of slinky evil, like a snake, of Lusankia. Kind of random pronunciation note. You asked me how to pronounce that lieutenant of Morath Duel on Kessel. Marc Thompson says Skinnixnex to pronounce that alien's name.
Is he from Jedi Academy trilogy?
He's either from Jedi Academy trilogy or Dark Empire. I can't remember which.
Because I was thinking if the lieutenant guy whose name I won't repeat because I can't do it as well, had been in Jedi Academy trilogy, that explains at a meta level why they were like, well, Duel won't give him up.
Well, yeah, because he can't leave Kessel then. Speaking of other things that Stackpole was clearly drawing from all kinds of things, both history and contemporary events, the Krytos virus, he's been upfront about the fact that he drew it from being really afraid of the Ebola virus, which, of course, in the mid 90s was pretty scary and present in the news at the time.
Yeah, and Wedge's Gamble has some very detailed descriptions of what Krytos does to alien bodies.
Not as bad as the first couple chapters of the Krytos
third book.
Oh
the
my
third
God.
book really goes even deeper.
And we'll talk about that because Stackpole has recently given an interview where he explains why he did that. But it's brutal. I mean, Kirtan Lure, who doesn't like aliens, talks about how he can't stand to watch them literally melting from the inside because of this virus. It's horrifying.
Yeah.
Speaking of non-humans and aliens, Noira's speech to the alien combine defending Gavin, a human, from being a bigot, and of course Corran's talking about dating a Solonian, interspecies dating, and Noira dating Rosati. It really highlights this theme of how aliens and humans get along or don't get along. How do you feel that Stackpole handles this issue in Noira's speech and these various scenarios and stories that come up throughout the book?
I think it definitely adds an element that's interesting to look at for Star Wars.
I think it's interesting. This is, I am curious to know how in touch Stackpole was with Kevin J. Anderson, because Anderson, I think either next year or the year after this, would write I want to say 4-book series or arc in the Young Jedi Knight series called Diversity Alliance, which actually borrows heavily from the both Wedge's Gamble and Krytos Trap, because there's this whole Emperor's Plague thing that goes on.
Well, we know he wasn't in contact with KJA about who Winter should be with.
Or who Wedge should be with.
Speaking of interspecies dating.
Speaking of interspecies dating, yes. But I think that the way Stackpole handles both interspecies dating and this issue of prejudice is definitely more compelling and more thoughtful than how Kevin J. Anderson handled it in Diversity Alliance. I think Diversity Alliance is honestly an awful arc. It makes no real sense philosophically or thematically. I think it was well-intentioned, but it doesn't work. The characters and the way they use it just doesn't work at all. I think it works better here. I honestly think that Alston handles it much better in Solo Command, and we'll definitely talk about it in Solo Command. I think the best exploration of this theme is in Vision of the Future by Timothy Zahn, which I have no intention of covering that one in this podcast, although I do want to do a live stream about it sometime, so we'll see. But I think there's definitely an element where Stackpole wants the ideal of society is where sentient species from all worlds and all species can get along, be friends. If they fall in love, it's totally fine if they get together. There's just this idea of almost a speciesless society, sort of like a classless society. And I think that's nice, but I'm not sure I wholly buy it, because I think it depends too much on aliens just being humans with fur or tails.
Well, he does set up that sometimes that doesn't fully work.
Yeah, but he kind of uses strawman examples. Like, humans almost never would date a Gamorrean. That's kind of a joke in Wraith Squadron. And so I just think that it's, I don't know, I feel like it could have used more work if he'd gotten into the perspective of some of the non-human characters, or really given them arcs, or I don't know. I feel like it's stronger than other examples like Diversity Alliance, but it's weaker than it could have been. I think it could have been much stronger. So you've already touched on all of those. Yeah, I think that pretty much wraps up all my main notes and thoughts about Wedge's Gandalf. Do you have any last thoughts before we move on?
Well, we could mention we kind of talked about the Coruscant defenses, but the fleet elements part of the notes.
Yeah, I kind of think we talked about it in the big picture stuff, where Isard theoretically is in charge of the whole empire, but she just has like 4 or 5 Star Destroyers.
Plus, she does have a lot of warlords to keep at bay.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that she couldn't pull, a fleet of 10 to 20 Star Destroyers, which would basically repel any invasion. But that means she basically gives up entire sectors to the warlords who are actively gobbling up territory. So I understand that she has to keep her fleet elements out there patrolling and protecting. But it just feels like the Coruscant sector fleet is super tiny.
But it does have the Golden Stations for whatever.
The super powerful golden stations that get taken out by mirrors. And I'm not saying that I think that is actually clever, but it is funny when you say it that way. I would say, to sort of close us out, Stackpole does have a gift for kind of small flourishes, like the captain, well, the lieutenant who commands the mirror station, who's actually the cousin of Captain Nita from Empire Strikes Back, and he has this whole sort of, do I serve the Empire? Do I serve the New Republic? It's kind of comedic, but also kind of serious. And of course, you also have a more serious plot of the captain of the interdictor from the last book, who was directly involved in the mission that killed Bror Jace at the beginning of this book, and then defects and joins the Republic. And she's kind of got this whole arc, and she's got this relationship with Rogue Squadron. So Stackpole really does have a lot of gifts as a writer, and he flourishes well in this book. And I reiterate what I said at the beginning. This is a really fun, pulpy adventure novel. It doesn't really let up. It's got really good action scenes that drag you along, and you get invested. You have a really good adventure.
Yeah, I mean the action scenes on the ground are really well described too.
Yeah, for sure. The firefights and the swoop chases and the Z95 and the the construction droid, just tons of really fun, exciting action adventure going on. All right, let's move on to our wing books. What book or other kind of story would we recommend to people who liked Wedge's Gamble?
So you want to go first?
Sure. So I'm going to recommend Timothy Zahn's Honor Harrington prequels. They all have a call to series. So like Call to Insurrection, Call to Loyalty, Call to Vengeance, all these things. And he basically tells the story of the most effective but professionally unlucky captain who ever served in the Manticore Navy, who I think he's been upfront about is kind of his own self-avatar, not like a Mary Sue, but he definitely put a lot of his own personality into this main character of these books. But there's a lot of great world building and texture and strategy and adventure stuff that goes on in the Honor Harrington prequels that are co-written by Tim Zahn that I think fans of Wedge's Gamble, with its adventure and strategy and all the world building, would really dig.
Yeah, so mine was a book I read around the same time as Wedge's Gamble when I was a kid, which I looked back at it, I was kind of like, whoa. So this is called The White Fox Chronicles. It's a much less well-known novel by the late Gary Paulson, who wrote like Hatchet
And 4 Hatchet sequels.
One of which is an alternate timeline of what if something happened. Yeah. So it's not like
many Hatchet books, man.
Super lined up with Wedge's Gamble, but it does have the main character who's only 14 years old. Organizing a resistance group behind enemy lines and having to complete his objective on a ticking clock at the end. It also has pilot character, and much like Hatchet, there is a point where the main guy has to take the stick because Pilot Woman's not doing too well. Looking back at it,
does she do better than the pilot and Hatchet?
oh yes, but looking
That's
back at it, and this book is like old classic pulp sized. There is a lot of implied torture scenes in the when people are being captured by the enemy.
Well, we will definitely talk about that in the next book.
Yep.
Speaking of which, next time, tune in to hear us talk about the Krytos Trap, the third book in the X-Wing series, also by Mike Stackpole, and of course our direct sequel to Wedge's Gamble. I want to thank you so much for listening. I've been Wedge.
I've been Wraith.
And keep your books locked in reading position.